Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Empower LEP podcast. I'm your host, Jana Parker. I'm a licensed educational psychologist, group practice owner, and mentor at Empower LEP. Today, I'm hosting Dr. Peter Isquith. He's a licensed psychologist. He has a specialty in pediatric neuropsychology. He practices in schools in Vermont and in New Hampshire. He has spent his career studying disorders of executive function and self-regulation. He is the co-author of numerous works on the topic, including The Brief and The Brief 2. Peter's clinical specialty is in working with deaf and hard of hearing individuals. We have a great conversation. It spans his career. It's a great example of how new experiences, areas of interest, and connections that we make with others really shape our practice through the years. Listen in, and as always, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Welcome, Dr. Peter Isquith, to the Empower LEP podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jen.
You are so welcome. And I am very happy to have you on because this is your first podcast ever, which I find hard to believe.
I don't watch podcasts. I don't really know what they are, boomer problems.
I guess, but I'm surprised no one has asked to talk to you on a podcast, but
I've been asked and I've with good intention said yes, absolutely, but then I get anxious because I don't know what to do.
Well, I will guide you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I will trust you.
Yeah. So, I brought you on because we have spoken before and I have heard a little bit of your story when we've just kind of talked offline. But you also share a lot when you give talks at, different conferences, and you have a really unique background. And now, in the, dare I say, later part of your career, you are working back in public education, or I don't know if I don't know if I'd say back in, but you're in public education. And so, I want to hear the whole story. Maybe we start with where you are now today, and then we kind of go back to the beginning.
So what I do as a psychologist has evolved, and one of the beautiful things about what we do is that we can change. And so every decade at least, I'm shifting, and I'm looking to shift again soon. I'm not sure exactly how or where, but I have some ideas. And the fun part of what we do is we have, as psychologists, we're trained to read. Certainly write, and usually to think a little bit, and to be creative, and with some focus like helping people, or for me, kids usually, and it's fun to change now and then, and to take a little bit of what we know, what we've done, and say, how do I apply that in a new context? And so for me, my background has kind of taken a lot of turns. And maybe not well managed always by me, or as aware as I should be if I were in business, which I'm not, or I'm not good at it. So let me put it that way. So I've ended up at this point, 2 days a week, I'm in a public school, high school, as their school psychologist, and doing assessments. We have another psychologist who sees all the kids for counseling, therapy, etc. I do most of the assessment stuff because I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist by training, and so assessment is my thing. But that's 2 days a week, and it's a pretty high-end school in the shadow of an Ivy League college up here. And then I do a day or two a week. I contract with a number of rural small schools in Vermont, and so I go out and I see some of their kids in the less well-off hollows of Vermont. And then I spend a day or two a week, whatever I have time, trying to write things, working on new projects, assessments. I do a lot of talks, certainly since COVID, and we all learned to do this online. All of a sudden, presentations, I don't have to take a day to get to California, do a talk, and then fly back, 3 days out of the week. It's hard to do that a lot and still to practice. But I love talking, as you'll see. So we do this. So I have quite a varied career. At this point, I get requests tomorrow. No, Friday, I'm going to drive 2.5 hours and I'm going to go see a little deaf kid because that's my clinical specialty is deaf and hard of hearing kids. And so I will go across the country and see them if needed.
Wow. Okay. So yeah. So, okay, I have a couple of questions. So you're a pediatric neuropsychologist and you're being a school psychologist in a public school. In Vermont, I mean, in California, you have to have a PPS credential. Is that similar in Vermont?
Vermont is the one place left in the country, I believe, where you can have a master's in psychology and be an independent licensed practitioner. Not even as a school psychologist, but as a master's in psychology. And so Vermont's a funny little place. Actually, I live on the border between Vermont and New Hampshire, so I'm a bit of a borderline. So I just pop over to New Hampshire for my school job. And there, in both New Hampshire and Vermont, as a licensed psychologist, so I have a license as a psychologist, I can work in a school. I do have to get my school credential as a license through the state. So I have done that where I'm on staff in New Hampshire, but in Vermont, because I'm an outside independent evaluator, I can just operate under my regular school, regular clinical license. It's a bit complicated, but there's a lot of need up here. Anybody want to come on up and work in Vermont? New Hampshire, certainly life is good. We drive a lot to go see a kid here, a kid there, and all over the place. But much practice up here in the North Country is independent practitioners serving kids in the schools, but not on staff because the schools are too.
Got it. Yeah, and in California, that we can be master's level or specialist level private practitioners.
Oh, you can?
Yeah, that's what I do, and that's kind of even what this podcast is about, because the term LEP is licensed educational psychologist. And you can be one of those at a doctorate level, but you can also be one of those at a master's level. So
that's a kind of an educationally focused work versus Vermont is unique in that you can have a clinical psychology license with a master's degree.
Got it. Okay. Very interesting.
That's the distinction there.
Got it. Okay. So in New Hampshire, but how did you get connected to this particular school? And do they even know how special you are?
Whether I'm special versus unusual is a good question. And unusual, yes. My office mate, who is a fabulous speech and language pathologist and just so organized, and I rely on her to organize me. I say, look, I will take on the burden of all of the assessments. You point me in the direction, and she just sets them up. She puts them in the schedule. Today, you're seeing this guy, this guy, this guy. Here are the questions. I say, thank you very much. So she's very organized. But she and the special ed team for I think my birthday this year gave me a Hawaiian shirt because that's my uniform, but it's covered with unicorns because she describes me as a unicorn. But how I got here, I came up, I was in, so we're gonna have to backtrack a little bit here.
Sure.
I started out my professional life in Baltimore at a tiny little pediatric rehab hospital that was affiliated at different years with Johns Hopkins, with University of Maryland, and then independent, and people kept buying us in some ways. But it was just a delightful 60 bed, something like that, 2-story. And we developed, I was there with Jerry Joya, who's my good friend, and he was really kind of the first pediatric neuropsychologist in Baltimore, if not Maryland. And it was a new thing back then. And so then he brought me in. Lauren Kenworthy was our postdoc. Steve Guy was another postdoc. And he built this program into, the community was hungry for what we did. And he built it into a very large program that then moved to Children's National Medical Center, where he's so big and successful, he has a building and so many people working there at all different levels of support. That's a good manager. But when he moved there, I'm like, I can't go to DC. That's not that's not who I am. I'm originally from up here. So I decided to move up here in 2000. I got a job at Dartmouth in psychiatry as a pediatric neuropsychologist. I stayed there 3 years. It wasn't a great fit for me. So I had made connections in the community, and much of the community up here are people who came to Dartmouth for the promise and then decided that it wasn't a great fit, but life is good here. So, we've got mountains and rivers and people hike and, kind of outdoors kind of stuff. And so they stay. And so it's a great community of providers who are all good at what they do. And people would say to me when I came up, let us know when you're ready. We will welcome. So I stepped out. I just got a little office and figured, I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist. They will come. And
Yeah.
it showed up, the schools came. So I started getting calls from the schools where I had been the independent evaluator through Dartmouth. And then I started getting, hey, we heard you're out. Will you work with us? And I thought, okay, sure. And then I talked with people who were doing it, and they said, yeah, it's easy. You go see a kid and you give them a bill. And so the business part works for me because I'm not good at that. And I was not interested in working. I tried working with insurance, and just the ridiculousness of doing that for me wasn't worth it.
Right. So you had schools, or were they public schools or private schools?
Yeah. It's just because they're so small.
Yeah.
For example, many of the schools I go to have 6 kids per grade. They don't have a staff psychologist.
Right.
So they will contract. One district I work with has 3 or 4 of us. We all, share, and I'll say, this looks like a student that would be better off with this other person who has the skill set for that.
Yeah.
And so we all work together. It's not really a competitive kind of world in the community. There's plenty of work. And there's some people we have people who are very successful in practice who do assessments, private pay. I don't know anybody up around here who takes any insurance for that.
Yeah.
So people find a niche. I did the independent practice, had an office, just me, for close to 15 years. And then I decided I was going to the office and then packing up my stuff and going to a school. And then I was going to another school. And I started back work at a hospital, at Boston Children's Hospital, 10 years ago. And so I was going down a couple of days a week to Boston and being there. So I had no reason to have an office. So I just closed it up. And that's then one of the schools where I was doing a lot of evaluations, the high school where I've ended up, and said, would you like to just come work a couple days a week? And at that time, I said, sure. I kind of looked at the numbers and I needed some health insurance and said, sure. And so it's really fun for me I love working in the school. The work is just contained. I have all the teachers I can send a note to. I can ask them what's going on. I don't have to chase people down. So it's a nice way to work for me.
Yeah. What a great story. That's really cool. So they do know you're a unicorn.
Not necessarily. The funny thing is, so I should disclose I'm an author of the brief, one of the first executive functional rating scale, and teachers fill it out and parents fill it out, but they don't read my name or anything, so they don't most of the time know. Some do, but it's not something I advertise or anything. I'm just a psychologist. And I'm seeing their kid, and sometimes parents come in and they do know because they'll these are parents who Google, and then sometimes they don't, and either way I'm not going to say, did you know I'm a special guy?
I'm very special.
Yeah, I do. As a neuropsychologically trained psychologist, I can't help myself, but when I see something unique that I've seen before, I will say, this looks like this, and perhaps we should talk with your neurologist and things like that. So, most of the bread and butter stuff that we do, LD and ADHD and autism questions. But every now and then, there's something unique that comes along that because of my training, I've seen before, and I'm helpful in that way sometimes.
Yeah, that would be an interesting place. I'm thinking about you kind of, in the schools where you're not really supposed to say it. You're supposed to be talking about ed code and sticking to that, right? So yeah, that must be an interesting place for you to be.
I think, sometimes we'll have a team meeting where we're interviewing, and I'll hear something like sluggish cognitive tempo, now known as cognitive disengagement syndrome. And, it's not an unusual thing. And so I'll hear that in the, I just can't get him motivated. He's not up, and, he doesn't, and this is really the decline which follows the history. And I start asking the questions, and I say, here's what I think we're looking at. And so tell me more. And I'm going to give you some questionnaires about that. And maybe we end up that way, maybe not. But sometimes it's fun for me. I enjoy the uniqueness of a child. I've run into people that sometimes I look at and I go, this is a person with a hearing loss, and we're in high school and nobody knew this. I mean, that's rare, but every now and then that'll happen. And this is my specialty. And so let's check this out a little bit more here. But that's always fun for me.
Yeah. Okay. So there are two things I want to ask about. One is executive function. One is deaf and hard of hearing. Let's go executive function first.
Okay.
It sounds like you have self-proclaimed executive skill weaknesses.
Yes.
So what made you so, I guess, interested in executive function, and how did that whole thing get started? And talk a bit about the development of your measure and what you find useful for it. Now, I love giving the brief, and I appreciate, just so you know, audience, I'm going to put you on. I hope you don't get inundated, but Peter will help you if you have questions about the brief. I appreciate that, you have been receptive to, if you're in a tough case or you're not really sure, you are very generous with, questions.
Sure.
So,
yeah. I like clinical stuff. That's what I do. I'm a reasonable clinician.
Yes.
From a assessment perspective, I am a terrible therapist. So I will not do any of that.
Me neither.
So for assessment, I've not ever been, I work very well with organized people, and I appreciate their abilities and their skills. And I appreciate, for example, my wife is a very thoughtful, organized. She was a teacher and a lawyer, and she's very good at going, stop that, or just reel it in, because I'm a little impulsive sometimes, which is a way to be creative. You want a little looseness in your thinking, because that's how you think outside the box. You don't want too much, because that looks crazy, right? But I've always admired well-regulated people. When I was in early elementary school in Philadelphia, I was always just staring at the well-regulated kid. It was like, how do you do that? How do you know all the answers and not shout them? Working with both Jerry Joya and I trained at Boston Children's. He a couple years before me. In Boston at the time, and still, Boston was the epicenter of this. In a large part, the way we think about neuropsychology, developmental neuropsychology, and first the developmental people, Jane Bernstein, Debbie Weber, Martha Denkla, were all there. And thinking about a developmental neuropsychological model, there was Edith Kaplan, the grand dame of neuropsychology from a process perspective, was there. And Norm Geschwind was over at the Beth Israel. And in this one area, when both Jerry trained there and then I trained there, and then later Lauren Kenworthy trained there, this was the Harvard Medical School area with the medical school, and then there was Boston Children's, and then there were so many hospitals with all of these really interesting people. Marcel Mesulon was across the street, and we would go to different people's, this is the Beth Israel neurology rounds, and you'd go sit and listen to these amazing people talk about brain and brain function, and so it was just riches of smart people who were founding this new field, and we would learn from them. And we had this model of executive function. I'd never heard of executive function. Then I show up and I'm an intern and I'm getting this, what is this thing? And then, a couple years of postdoctoral fellowship and, learned a lot. And of course, we would think about executive functions clinically. We wrote about them. And then I go to Baltimore with Jerry, and we're going out to schools and nobody knows what we're talking about. And they're like, you're just making this stuff up. And so we were, at the time, this was 93, when I started working with Jerry in Baltimore, and there weren't kid tests of executive function. We were using adult measures that had kid norms, 28-year-olds. And that's, we would not accept that these days, but we were doing that. And there was a literature of 10 papers looking at these tests. And then the NEPSI came out. The NEPSI we were so excited. We had a pile of them because, the first co-normed developmental executive battery for kids. And we were giving them, we gave like 100 in a row. And what we were seeing was that kids who were described as very dysregulated in the real world were doing great on the tests. And kids who were described as well-regulated in the world, teacher's pet, perfectly, were bombing the tests, and it wasn't making sense to us. So Jerry and I both had trained in a model of executive function based on an interview. And it took, 45 minutes to go through just the executive functions. So is Johnny impulsive? And they'd say, oh, no. And then you have to follow that up with, well, so do you trust him by himself on the street? Well, no, we don't do that. Well, why not? And so we would dig into the story a little bit. And honestly, managed care came through. And our colleagues who were early reviewers for managed care said, hey, guys, you're getting cut back by 2 hours on what we'll authorize. I'm like, why? And they said, because the insurance wants to make more money. We're like, okay, so where are we going to save that time? And Jerry and I sat down. We're gonna write down a developmental history questionnaire because we were asking those questions. I've not done that yet. I still do it. And then I didn't get around to it. And then we said, what if we took this lengthy executive functional kind of interview and we wrote it down? And so we just took what parents had told us. We went through our interview notes and we pulled, well, they said this, and then we started testing them out. And eventually it just became a checklist. And then it became a yes, no. And then it became a 1, 2, 3. And eventually, and we had no intention of creating an instrument. This was for us. And one of our colleagues who has published a number of measures came along and said, you guys should think about publishing it. So we talked with publishers. They all said no. They all said no one has any interest in this. They have all since made 1 or 2. Even a well-known test author, I believe you've interviewed once in, I think, 1998, contacted us and said, hey, can I see that questionnaire you have in your slides? And then we still see our slides showing up in their talks. This was always my favorite thing. So we created this measure, which has provided us with an avenue for research, a focus of, okay, what that has morphed a lot over time. At first, we focused on, does this thing work? And with whom? And so we were working on this thing. We talked with publishers. They all said no. There was this new thing called the internet. This is before the web. There was no graphics. And we shared with some of our colleagues around the world. And we showed up at a Neuropsych Society meeting in, I think, 2001. No, can't remember. Somewhere in the or late 1990s, and there was a whole row of posters using our measure. They called it the Joya. They called misspelled. They called it the executive. They called it all kinds of things. But the people we had shared it with had collected data, had done research, and really interesting stuff. And there was this whole interest. And so our publisher, PAR, said, "Do you guys want to talk?" And we said, "Sure, we'll talk." We were kicking each other on the table a little bit. Hey, they got interest, which was just fun for us. And we set out to, I'm not a test developer. I'm not a jack of all trades that does that and this and stuff. I'm a clinician. And we had developed this pathway of research interest that has morphed into a whole lot of directions, which we can talk about, kind of the melding of international sports in youth and what we're learning about executive function self-regulation with sports with our colleagues in around the world, and how we're trying to bring this back here from what they've learned, and so it's been a fun ride in that way.
Interesting. So yeah, and it keeps going.
It does, yes.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for being interested in that and for developing something that is so useful in our practice.
We've done others that haven't been successful. So I developed with Jerry a computerized measure called the Tech, and it was hard to understand because it used research-oriented kind of tasks, and then computers updated, changed, and it killed it, which was sad. And we've developed concussion measures and other kinds of fun stuff like that, because it really is a pleasure doing these things.
Can you speak a little bit to the effectiveness of using the brief in an evaluation over maybe other measures of, like, direct measures of executive function or attention?
Interesting. So
you don't have to, but
well, no, it's a favorite topic. It's one of the things I like to talk about when I do webinars. I think I recorded one for PAR. It's probably there on using tests, the performance measures tests, or what you just called direct measures, and which is a hot button, by the way, and using rating scale, and the one that has all the data is the brief. Right. And there's I think they're both useful. I do them both all the time. But integrating them is a challenge. So there was a recent call for papers posted on a neuropsychology listserv, referring to objective versus subjective measures of executive function. So a lot of people like to refer to things like the brief as a subjective measure, and I get where that's coming from, versus tests which are objective. And that raised a lot of questions from people who develop assessments about, so given that things like rating scale, like the brief, correlates much better with real world functioning because it's measuring real world, it's not magic, and diagnoses like ADHD and autism and things like that, than any of your tests do. How is this subjective and not actually the more objective? So let's call them rating scales and performance measures, kind of. But there's a whole debate about that too. So it's interesting. I think the first article, I hope, will be an argument about how do we refer to these things. But that's a little niche kind of thing. I do both. I use the brief, not always. I've got this kiddo I'm going to see on Friday, and I'm like, do I give these parents in this probably maybe intellectually disabled child a brief, a BASC, which is, I need to know this stuff, and an adaptive measure? Nah, that's too much. I'm going to drop the brief in this case. I can actually, the student has a lot of self-regulation problems, but it's not really an executive issue. It's more of a, I'm tired and you're making me sit in school and I don't get what's going on kind of thing. So I'll pick and choose, certainly. Most people, for me, get a broadband like VASC and a brief. And then I do performance measures like most people. The challenge is always integrating, and that's one of my interests, is how do we think about what these two things mean when, from the research perspective, the performance measures, the tests that I do, show a small difference between kids with a condition and kids without the condition, and don't really discriminate well between different conditions. It's just, kind of like the average kid with ADHD on these performance measures might get a score of a 93 instead of 100 on a 100 plus or minus 15 scale. So we wouldn't make much of it. But on the brief, they might get something that's 2 standard deviations off, which we would make something. And so how do we make sense of that is kind of a challenge that I hope we'll be writing about in this new journal issue.
Yeah, that will be interesting. I find that a lot. And like you were saying a little bit ago, you were finding when you were giving some of the measures many, many years ago that some of the kids with the most impulsivity, or like the weakest self-regulation, were doing well on the tests. Yeah. I find that a lot too.
Many people over the years have written about this. One of my favorite papers was Bruce Pennington and Sally Ozanoff back in 1996. They were the first, let's look at tests of executive function in OCD. And what about Tourette's? And what about ADHD? And what they said was, there's so many factors that go into test performance. And one of them is we're containing we are structuring, we're directing, we're starting, stopping, organizing, because that's how you get reliability on a test, is you set the parameters, which is different from real world.
Right.
Russ Barkley said it. I mean, Kaplan wrote, lots of people have written about this. Russ Barkley said it in, my favorite quote is from him, I think in 2012, and I included probably in all my talks, which is, assessing executive functions with psychometric measures tests is grossly inadequate. And then he goes on to say why. That it's not capturing this multi-level, concentrically arranged, everyday life that is culturally influenced, that is influenced by, that is emotionally driven. You have a kid come in who's just had a really bad morning. Why test them? You're not going to do it because they're not well regulated right now. In fact, a funny thing, if I may, when we were creating our little executive function questionnaire, we looked at how does everybody define it? We didn't create a definition. We asked, that wasn't our goal. We asked, okay, how do you define it? We asked lots of people. And we read everybody. And this wasn't well defined back then. There was an argument back then. Is executive function one big glob or unitary? Or can we actually fractionate it? Can we say inhibitory control is different from working memory? Now it's kind of a given. We know this. Back then we didn't. So we asked people, we wrote them down, we took everybody's definition and we stuck them on paper on the wall and we drew lines. Well, Russ Barkley says this, but it really is the same language as what Pennington's talking about over here. And so we lined them up. Emotion regulation wasn't a thing. It wasn't an executive function by any means. We added it in the brief because we were clinicians. We still are full-time clinicians. And what we noticed was that your executive functions in our kids were heavily influenced by their emotional state and their ability to regulate their emotions at the time. And then we got into this whole argument about, well, is it your executive functions controlling your emotions? And so that's the problem. Or is it your emotional system overwhelming your executive system? And both are true. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we created the emotional control scale on the brief, so that we could have this little check, not because we thought it was an executive function, but because we thought it was a check on, hey, before I interpret all of this cognitive, the working memory and planning and stuff, I should know something about the person's emotional state or general functioning in the real world before I interpret things fully. And we still agree with that. What's been interesting to us is that we started working on the brief in '94, and in, I think, 2012, everybody else published a measure of executive function. They all included an emotion regulation scale. And we're like, I wonder if they thought that through, or understood, because it's not an executive function per se. We use our executive system to regulate our emotions, but our emotions, they're tightly neurologically intertwined, that they're very, very reciprocal, that your emotional system, this isn't also a new interest of mine that I'm diving into more and more, that your emotional system fires up and connects immediately with your frontal system, which then says, okay, settle that down, because you're in a situation where you need to be making an argument in court, for example. You got to contain yourself, right? And so you have this balance, versus sometimes it just overwhelms the executive system. Sometimes the executive system needs to charge up the emotional system. So there's this really unique, this unique space between executive functioning and emotion regulation. And when we look at people's strategies, it's really interesting to see, young children, we use distraction. They're getting worked up. They're not containing it. We go, hey, look over there, right? Here's a treat. And they go, oh, and then they settle down, right? Young kids, or less developmentally typical kids, will need that. And then there's, by high school, kids are using suppression. I'm just not going to think about it. Just broke up with my girlfriend. She dumped me. I'm not going to think about it today. Not very successful, right? Because you're using all your resources to do that. But what we found is that teenagers, as they are starting to reassess and use reframing, that's the more effective method, because if you can rethink it and reframe something, then you don't have to suppress your emotional system, and it allows for your executive functions to work better. So there's another rabbit hole there for me.
Yeah. No, thank you. I feel like I could go down these rabbit holes, but I also feel like I need to regulate the conversation.
Yes. Thank you. And I'm letting you do this. I am expecting you to do that.
Yeah. No, but you just have, like my brain's going like, boom, boom, boom. So for another time.
Okay.
But okay. So I also do want to hear about how you got into working with the deaf and hard of hearing population. And that is just, again, really unique. And yeah, take us there.
I think that every one of us should be learning a second language growing up. It's so much easier. And I just had the good fortune, plus or minus, to grow up with someone who's deaf and signs and doesn't talk. And so I grew up signing, and so it's natural for me. That has taken me myriad places that I otherwise would not have gone. So I've had a very fortunate life in that my local public college was University of Michigan. So, I went to a place where people know the name because of the football team. Had some interesting experiences. I was miserable. I left, and I went to an interpreter training program at the National Technical Institute for the Deaf in Rochester to become an interpreter, which is different than signing. So I learned, the professional rules of interpreting. And to make money, I was playing guitar in a bar downtown, and a director of this theater that was starting up, Theater of the Deaf, saw me and said, "Don't you sign and you do this? Why don't you join next year?" So I didn't go back to school for a few years. I went on the road with the Theater of the Deaf. I was the musician in a Theater of the Deaf, if that tells you anything about my musical skills. So my wife likes to remind me of that sometimes. So but what I got to see was I stayed in just about every school for the deaf in this country and in Canada, and worked with the kids, and it killed me. There were kids who went up to Newfoundland, and there were kids from Labrador who were helicoptered in off the ice floes and went home once a year. And they were 3. And I was like, oh my God, somebody's got to, somebody's got to work with these kids. And so that kind of drove me. I had been pre-med at Michigan, and I went back and I went into speech and language. I finished my pre-med stuff, but I wasn't good at it. And something about organic chemistry at 8 o'clock in the morning. No, just, and he didn't speak English, and I could not teach myself that. But I went into speech and hearing sciences, which I did get, and it was very natural to me. And with psychology came along with it.
Yeah.
And it was psycholinguistics. I was learning Vygotsky, thought and language, and Vygotsky said you got to hold stuff in working memory to self-regulate. So I didn't know that until, a couple of years ago, when I was reading some old papers on how people talked about executive function, and they talked about it in terms of higher order cognitive processes. I had a class called Higher Order Cognitive Processes as an undergraduate in about like 1979. It was all about executive function. I had no idea until recently. Oh, I learned that. So that's why it came natural. So I did speech and hearing, and then I went back on the road with the deaf, get some more experience. I went on a tour with Children of Lesser God, way back when, was a Broadway play, and I toured with them for a while, and learned that I wasn't going to be in the theater. So then I'm sitting in theater offices late at night on typewriters, typing out applications to graduate school in psychology. I applied to 3. I did not hear from one. The other one said, "You got to be kidding me." And then University of Buffalo said, "Your sign language skills, that's a really interesting thing. We should have someone in the field who can do that." And so I got lucky and I went there and went to Boston Children's for internship. They had they have a very unique program that serves deaf and hard of hearing kids, where we have psychologists who sign, developmental pediatricians who sign, ENTs who don't necessarily sign, but they're interested. And so I had the good fortune of working with them for a while, doing my training there. And so my sign language skills, and sometimes it's I can do an assessment with sign or not. Most of it is not, but and in different places, where I've worked, because it's changed over time, I'll use it more than not. These days, I'm interested in training other people. We're not making signing psychologists anymore.
Yeah.
Because lots and lots of deaf kids are getting implants and focusing on talking and not signing. So we're not raising SIBs and children of deaf people who sign naturally. So we have a very hard time finding people. School psychology has done a better job than clinical of finding people who sign and can work directly with deaf people, which is my preference if it's a signing deaf person. But because we can't, the handful of us who are clinical and certainly neuropsychological, the handful of us who do this can't see all of the deaf kids who need it. So I've been working more and more along with my colleagues to try and provide more training, more information. How would you go about it if they don't sign? If they do, here are the questions. Because we want people to feel more comfortable and capable and not make mistakes. And so sometimes I'll help people, but then I'll also video watch and help out and make sure that things are going okay, so that it's ethical and good work. Yeah. Because I've seen too many unfortunate situations where people are misunderstood, and then evaluation can go sideways pretty quickly with some disastrous results. For example, I worked on a case with a professional who lost their license for a while because of an evaluator who not knowing what they didn't know. It wasn't necessarily a bad job. They didn't know what they know, and they missed some really important stuff and made some claims that were not accurate. We fixed it, but just I don't like to see that stuff. Yeah. So the deaf and hard of hearing stuff is a passion of mine, and it hasn't turned out the way that I thought it would originally, where I would focus on seeing just deaf and hard of hearing kids. I haven't ever done that, but it's a skill I do enjoy pulling out now. But if I had my way, we would all grow up and we should, from those early classes in language development that I had, we would all grow up with a couple of languages, because it's easy when you're a kid, and wouldn't it be wonderful if everybody had some other language?
Right, right. Yeah, well, that's a really interesting niche. And I remember it was so just really kind of you at, can't remember where we were, NASP, CASP, somewhere, LDA.
Learning Disabilities
Yeah,
Association,
Learning
LDA.
Disabilities Association, and they didn't have an interpreter,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and the closed captions weren't working, and you were just like, I can't, obviously I don't sign, but you were like, I got
Right.
this. You just,
Oh, you're a deaf person? Let me do
yeah,
this. Now,
right.
to be fair, it's politically incorrect to talk and sign at the same time. That's called SimCom. And I grew up with that because that was the mode of communication at the time, and that's how I was trained as an interpreter, but that's not usually what we do. But the deaf person who signed said, that is what I do and what I need. So I was okay. It changes both my talking and my signing, so it slows me down, which is not a bad thing. But I've run into that now and then where I was at a conference, and the organization, they didn't know how to hire good quality interpreters. They hired a crew that couldn't keep up with the needs.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can imagine the specialty language of psychology, whether school or clinical, or certainly neuropsychology, we're using big words and stuff.
Right.
And you've got to have an interpreter with a good English vocabulary and good understanding of the concepts. And these folks didn't. And so I found myself, the poor, deaf client, I'm watching the interpreter while I'm talking. I'm like, they have no idea what I'm talking about.
Right.
So I said, do you want me to sign and talk at the same time? They say, yeah, please.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
I'll do that sometimes. It's not the best situation, but
yeah,
we do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your work in that area too. So I guess I want to ask, the other topic I think I want to cover really briefly is just that you do, your publisher is PAR, and you do these PAR talks. And I mean, anybody can just register and sign up for them. I've seen your name several times. Like, are you doing more than other people? What's kind of the goal of PAR talks, and how is PAR trying to get people involved, and what kinds of people should be involved or listen?
Sure. Well, so PAR Talks is the overall umbrella of PAR provides webinars.
Okay.
And it amazes me the topics that are there, because I think they kind of started with, in the early days of webinar, it started with, Peter, will you talk about your test? And so, my friends like to make fun of me because I'm very awkward. And I'm like, and here's this slide and this slide there, or no, and it's like very awkward. But you'll find, somebody like Steve Pfeiffer talking about his work, and Cecil Reynolds talking about the RIAS and other measures, and I talk about the brief. And what happened was, pandemic time. I noticed on some of our listservs and our Facebook groups, this said No School Psychologist Ever group, which is, useful and interesting. And I love the irreverence sometimes on there. And the Testing Psychologist are the two that I follow. I know there's lots, but those are the two that I started with, and I can't handle more. And I noticed that there was an increase in, I want to talk about a case, and we were separate. We didn't have our colleagues, and we were isolated. And so I approached PAR and I said, what if I did like a case presentation, a grand round style, an hour, because people could fit in. We did 3 o'clock on East Coast so that people are finishing their work day or lunch where you are, and so could take an hour, and I'll just chat through a case. And what I wanted was to have everybody else come and present, and a lot of people are like, nah. So I have to dig up cases all the time. I'm out. I'm looking right now for what am I going to talk about now. And, we figured some people would come, and the response has been, it goes up and down. If there's an autism presentation with somebody who really knows autism, we get a lot of people. If it's just me, not so much. But I started doing it because of, I think people wanted to think about and talk about cases, and we're excited about that. And this is the 5th year, and I think this probably be my last. But at the same, because seriously, I'm out of cases. So that's psychological assessment rounds, or PAR by PAR. Within PAR Talks, and PAR Talks is a much broader venue, and they're all free, and they give CEs. They give school psych CEs or clinical psych APA CEs, whichever you want. You just sign up for them, and they're free, which is a real, so people once a month or twice a month can grab a couple of hours of CE just by having their lunch and watching. So they have a lot of topics on the PAR Talks. I attend a lot of them when they, if I can fit them in my schedule, and they'll be like working with Spanish-speaking kids, working with other kids from different cultures. Not really assessment or testing focused so much, but just interesting topics that people are interested in. I hope that we'll do one. One of my colleagues, Jen Reisman, who wrote about, they just are coming out with a book, or just published a book on the science of the pandemic and what it did to kids in education and what we need to know. And I had the opportunity to review it, and I'm like, wow, we need this. So I've asked her to join me for a PAR by PAR talk to do a couple of cases where we should be thinking about how this child's experience during the pandemic, lack of school, change in education, how do we think about that in our current assessments? But also to then do a PAR talk presenting the science of what their review came. So I think that will happen soon. So it's, I try and sometimes coordinate one of my case talks with the factual stuff that somebody will do in a PAR talk. But I think the growth, I noticed that Pearson, I just signed up for one today, is doing a lot of, assessment talks as well. And not always, here's our test. Those are good ways to learn about new materials or to practice up on tests that you have, but also on topics that are related to avenues of assessment for which they may or may not sell a test for. So that's pretty cool stuff. And I just think, unlike where it's great to go to conferences like LDA where we met and had a nice chat. And I'm going back this year to do a talk for them. Are you going?
No, it's like Orlando, right? I couldn't go that far.
It's a long ways to go to sit in someplace warm again, isn't it? When you're from the Bay Area.
Yeah, Vegas was easy, but
sure, yeah. So I'll go there and do another talk this year. So sometimes I go there, but I like live presentations because of the feedback. Most of the time when you're doing webinar, you're just, the only person I see is me.
Right. And
I'm always enjoying the talk, but I'm never sure if other people are enjoying the talk. So, it's one of the since this is or supposed to be kind of a career focused. I started out wanting to be a professor when I was an undergrad. I wanted to stay in college, and I just never was able to make that happen. A few years ago, I applied for some teaching positions in small colleges, and a couple of them were like a school psych program that was needing someone to supervise clinical assessment, and they said it'd be great if somebody had some neuropsychological chops. I'm like, I could do that. And they said, and we're near a school for the deaf, and sometimes we see those kids. I'm like, I'm your guy, and they're like, nah, we're no interest. Okay, all right. So I think I'm too old to do that now, but maybe I'll find a way. But I teach through my webinars, and I love trying to share information, trying to engage people in stretching their skills or their thinking in different ways.
Yeah.
So that's how I do my teaching.
Yeah.
My next career, I am probably moving back to Philly in the next year or so. My wife is from there, and I started out there. We actually lived down the street from each other. We did not know each other,
Wow.
and we both went to Philly Public Schools. And I want to head back, and I will probably try and find a way to engage with them, and maybe I can help out in some way and give back a little bit to where I started.
Wow. Awesome.
So
Great.
change yet again.
Yeah. Why, do you have family back there where in Philly? Like, why did,
So my wife and I both started there.
right.
She has family there.
Okay. Okay. So you do still have
Our,
family there.
my kids and her kids are all kind of converging on Philly. You
Okay.
know,
Yeah, that's what I thought might be happening.
they're there. I want to keep my place in Vermont if I can, because Mid-Atlantic is hot in the summer. It's hard, so it
Yeah.
would be hard. But you know, being able to be in more of an urban setting, for me, an hour drive to get to the store for milk is normal. Uh, I'd like to go down the street, walk to the corner, and get the milk and the newspaper, and maybe have a coffee in a store or something. But that's just
Yeah.
not doable.
Yeah. Yeah. I get it. I get it.
One
Well,
of the things when you move up here is if you forgot to pick up something at the store on the way home, it's a half-hour drive back, and they're closed. So you're just trapped. It's not going to happen.
well, you kind of led yourself through the last few questions I was going to ask you, which one was just kind of about, career oriented, and then the other was, what are you doing next? And then the last one really is, if you have, any guidance for people who are kind of like moving through this profession, whether they be at the beginning or in the middle or even towards the end, just, what are the things that have gotten you through? It's such an interesting profession that we're in. And I really think that we are always growing and learning and getting interested in different things that inspire us to go different ways. Just what's something you would say to people just at whatever point in their career, that has helped you along the way, or that knowing what you know now, what you might say?
Well, I think reaching out to people who are in the field or doing, I think every step of the way, like when I went to private practice or independent practice, I asked people who are doing it, how does this work? And they gave me good advice. There are books now, but there weren't back then. Going into academics, what do I need to do? Julie Alexander started who interviewed with you, started in as a school psychologist, and she ended up with a test publisher. She was amazing. I loved working with Julie and her colleagues back in the day, just going around and her business skills, which I admire, and her people skills. So talking with people who are doing something interesting or differently. There are psychologists who go into business and who go into organizations as researchers, or I'm having fun these days consulting with some pharmaceutical companies who happen to use my measure, and then they come to me and say, "What does it mean?" I'm like, "Well, let's look at your data." And they have psychologists who work in them sometimes, or and I advise undergrads who are thinking of going to grad school in psych, because a lot of them are like, well, I guess I've got a psych major, so I should go to grad school. It's like, no. You need to think about this carefully. This is quite a commitment. And what do you think you're going to make? I start with that one. And they say, oh, it doesn't matter. I was like, well, you're going to have some bills to pay. So let's talk about it. But how to I think it's really important that people talk to other people who are doing it, and most people are happy. We're happy to give guidance.
Okay.
I ended up in grad school in psychology, in clinical psychology, because I bumped into a guy at a festival in Rochester, New York. I was sitting there with my girlfriend, who was an interpreter, and her friend, who was an interpreter, came up, and she happened to be with Bob. And Bob was in grad school at University of Buffalo. And he said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I think I'm going to be a counselor, because I didn't know.
Yeah.
And he said, you don't want to do that. I'm like, well, what do I want to do? And he said, you want to go into psychology? Like, okay. You want to go to clinical psychology? Okay. You want to apply to Buffalo? And I did. And I got it. And here I am. So, just that kind of influence. The poor guy, he doesn't know how dramatically altered the course of my life. But, talking with people who do it to get some sense, because we navigate such a course of, did you end up in I got to pay for my degree or I got paid to go to school? Because that changes your outcome.
Right.
And people don't know. And did I go to counseling or clinical or school? And which one takes me where I want to be and allows me to do the things that I want to do? And so I think it's really important that people, before they jump or as they're thinking about jumping, where can I jump to and how do I navigate the changes? Yeah. And it's been quite a privilege to have have the training that I did, because I can change, and I'm gonna again and again.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more. I think that talking to people, hearing stories, learning from others, hearing just things that we don't know. I mean, we can ask ChatGPT now all day, but I think I would like to stick to asking people. But I appreciate that you are so accessible. I appreciate that you provide feedback in those Facebook groups and you answer questions, and you're always willing to, like different state associations that I've been a part of, that you have come and given talks to, especially in the virtual format, it's a lot easier. But I think, you've just been a really influential in the field, and your story is really unique and interesting, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us.
As my chair said when I was leaving Dartmouth, he said, "Well, you're unusual." And I said, "Yes, and you should have known that. That's why I'm." But I appreciate your business skills, your savvy in watching you build your practice and grow it. I've always admired people who can do this. I have a colleague that I interned with who built the biggest practice in Massachusetts and sold it to a big corporation. He's racing horses and buying yachts. Nice. And here I am in my little office, and he was always like laughing at my business lack of acumen. So I could have, probably done a lot more. But it wasn't the direction that was important to me. But I always admire people who are very clear and have the skills and the savvy like you do to build something and to expand it and to provide, quality services while also managing the stuff that you have to as the business owner. I think that's a really great skill set to have.
Thank you. Well, I keep learning that every day also. I'm doing my best to, I'm really trying to provide an avenue for people who are either educational psychologists or I'm building my intervention support for kids with people who do intervention. And I'm learning how to manage a business, and with the goal is to provide the support for the families in our community, but also to provide a place for people to actually have a career in the private sector that is part of a group, where they feel like we're a multidisciplinary team, similar to how we are in schools, but that I can, support people's lives. It's hard out here in California too, because I want people to come and think oh, I can work here and I can stay for a while, right? And be a team. So all of it is, a pretty complicated balancing act, but I'm definitely learning a whole new skill set, and I wouldn't trade it for the world, but I really find my mind a lot in business these days, which I never thought. I mean, I was in college with friends who were econ majors, and I was like, what is that? What's econ? I had no interest at all. And then I find myself in this position, but this was just where I wanted to be. And it's been a learning curve, and it keeps going, but it's invigorating, and I'm loving it. I'm loving my team.
We sometimes look at people who have found a place like you have and who are successful and think they must have been direct and driven, but learning about, some of the greats like Russell Barkley, he must have been driven. He started in community college nearby and struggled along and found his way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so people have very interesting circuitous paths sometimes to get, and then with all of that collective skill set, become what you're doing.
Yeah.
Now, are you going to executive coaching as part of your business?
We do have executive coaching as part
Oh,
of
you
it.
do? Okay. All right. Do you have a particular model that you use or like?
It's I'm a Peg Dawson fan.
Okay, me too.
And I'm also a Russ Barkley fan.
Yeah.
And I don't manage or run the executive skill program that we have, but I have one person right now who's doing it, and I don't know that I would say that she uses one particular model that she runs off of, but we are in the process actually of onboarding 2 new people right now, which I'm extremely excited about. And they are going to build out kind of, I don't want to say curriculum, but I'd like to say like a theoretical model and then a process for how we're going to run, whether they see this clinician or that clinician, it'll be, there will be some consistency with that. So that's kind of the excitement of what we're doing right now. Do you have any?
We should talk more.
I would love to. Yeah, I was going to ask, like, do you have any, you want to come on in?
I don't. Being a therapist is not my skill set. But I do know people who, there's the Sarah Ward model, there's Smarts, there's the Beyond Book Smart folks, and then, Peg Dawson's books. When I went into independent practice, I was doing an outside evaluation for the school where I work now. And it was early days of executive function language up here. And I go in with this student, and the parents say to the school team, my child has some executive issues. What are you going to do? And the school just kind of stared. And I said, wait, hold on. I have this book. It's by Dawson and Ware, and it's called Executive Skills Coaching. Take a look at this. Fast forward 10, 15 years, that's the school I'm working for. It's in the genetic material. So all the teachers know a coaching approach. We have an executive coach and a program for kids who need an extra level, but not special ed. And then we have special ed, but they all do an executive model. They're teaching LD modifications and stuff like that, but through this coaching model, which has been really great to see.
That's great. Yep. I got those on my shelf right here. That is so awesome. That's great that you had that kind of influence and that all the teachers are doing it. They probably have kids with, I don't know, maybe fewer executive skill challenges if they're teaching it or if they're embedding it in their curriculum.
They do. And we have a study skills class, but it's all about a coaching model. And within that, then she'll teach, okay, today we're going to take 15 minutes to learn a note-taking method that you might like. Okay, pick it, and then tomorrow we'll do a different one, et cetera. And so she has these different methods, but within a coaching model. And it wasn't me, it was Dawson and Ware, who's working. And actually Peg has come out with a new edition of Smart but Scattered.
Yeah.
That we'll take a look at soon.
Yeah, me too. Well, thank you, Peter, so much for being on the show. It has been an absolute pleasure talking with you, and I'm certain we will be in touch.
Okay, it was good seeing you again, and thanks for letting me talk about myself.
Absolutely. I mean, what could be better?
I know. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Empower LEP podcast. Episodes can be found at empowerlep.com. If you liked what you heard, please leave a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, or if you have any questions for me, don't hesitate to connect. I would love to learn more. I can be found at jana@empowerlep.com.